If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. Winter 1944 pressed down on the remote Allied airfield in northern France with a weight that felt permanent. The cold was not a passing condition. Every night it settled deeper into metal, fuel lines, and human nerves. The ground crews started each morning by hitting frozen propellers with wooden mallets, scraping ice from oil panels, and trying to keep their numb fingers steady while unlocking cowling latches that refused to move. Engines that had been warm the night before were solid again by dawn. Fuel trucks struggled to start. The runway froze in layers that cracked like glass beneath the wheels of Jeeps. This base existed for one purpose: to keep B-17 and B-24 bombers in the air long enough to strike German industrial targets across occupied territory. If these aircraft failed to leave the ground, infantry units at the front paid the price. Every delayed mission meant less cover, fewer destroyed enemy supply lines, and more Allied losses. That knowledge made tempers sharp. Officers demanded results that crews could not give. Pilots argued with mechanics about engines too cold to trust. The line chiefs held daily reports filled with red marks. Engines locked, oil lines burst, bearings cracked. Corporal Elias Mercer, a mechanic in his late 20s, kept his distance from the noise. He had been transferred from another airfield after surviving a year of non-stop repairs under artillery fire in Italy. The loss of his two brothers, one killed on the Eastern Front, the other missing near Bastogne, pulled him inward. He rarely spoke unless necessary. He followed orders, completed his tasks, and avoided anything that resembled small talk. The younger mechanics saw his quiet behavior as odd, and rumors grew around him. They imitated the way he stood alone, called him the ghost in the hangar, and laughed when he experimented with unconventional repairs. Mercer did not respond. He knew he lacked their energy, their optimism, their ability to joke about the war. He could not force himself to be someone he was not. What mattered to him was simple. Engines either worked or they didn't, and if they didn't, lives were lost. That clarity was the only thing that kept him steady. Among the personnel on the base, the only one who treated him with consistent respect was Sergeant Amelia Carter, a senior mechanic known for her discipline and fairness. She had arrived from a stateside training command and quickly earned a reputation for precision. She was direct, controlled, and focused on the technical mission rather than the personalities behind it. She recognized Mercer's competence immediately and never questioned his quiet methods. Her presence gave the hangar a stability others lacked. Crews followed her instructions without hesitation. By the middle of December, the situation had become critical. The cold deepened, and the supply chain failed to keep up. Replacement oil lines, engine covers, and spare bearings were weeks behind schedule. Some officers argued for grounding the entire fleet until parts arrived. Others insisted that missions continue no matter the risk. One afternoon, B-17, returning from a sortie, attempted to land with a failing engine. Ice had formed in the oil tube mid-flight, starving the bearings. The crew barely kept the aircraft level. When it rolled to a stop in front of the maintenance line, smoke drifted from the nacelle and the smell of burned metal filled the frozen air. Pilots climbed out unsteady on their feet, shaken by the near crash. Ground crews gathered around the engine, pulling at frozen panels, arguing with one another about what tools were needed. Officers demanded answers. The younger mechanics blamed the weather, the parts shortage, or the pilot's throttle handling. Mercer pushed through the crowd and examined the engine without speaking. He ran a gloved hand along the inner cowling. Frost coated the metal in patterns that told him how the cold had traveled through the compartment. The stress lines on the burned bearings confirmed the freezing point had reached deeper than expected. He crouched lower, studying the frozen oil intake while the cold pressed into his knees. His mind became focused in a way he trusted. He did not think about the officers shouting for an estimated repair time. He did not listen to the younger mechanics arguing. Instead, he followed the technical problems step by step. The engine did not fail because of one point of ice. It failed because an entire system allowed cold to spread faster than crews could fight it. Covering the engine with blankets and heating it with torches was no longer enough. Waiting for proper equipment was pointless. The temperature dropped faster than their tools could compensate. He stood slowly, feeling a sharp ache in his fingers, and looked at the interior of the cowling again. The problem was clear. The engine needed controlled, consistent warm air, not improvised bursts of heat. Something had to enclose the engine fully and direct warmth through every frozen line. A thought formed, steady and simple. Something they didn't have. Something no regulation explained how to build. He did not say it aloud. He knew how it would sound. But as he walked back toward the damaged, half-collapsed hangar he had been using for night work, he felt a shift inside himself. Something between determination and dread. The idea was crude. It would require scrap materials. It would likely draw more jokes, more stares, more comments about him losing it. Yet he could not ignore the image forming in his head. A sealed heating tunnel, constructed for whatever metal they had, forcing warm airflow around the entire engine. He paused at the entrance of his dark hangar. The roof groaned under the weight of ice. Wind cut through the broken panels. But it was quiet, and he needed quiet to work. This airfield was failing. Aircraft were failing. Men were dying because engines froze before they reached altitude. He made his decision. He would build the device, approval or no approval. It was the first real decision he had made in months that carried purpose rather than obligation. And in the cold emptiness of that hangar, he finally felt something other than loss. He felt the pull of a solution. The hangar was colder than the air outside. Frost clung to the exposed beams, and every step Mercer took sent a thin echo through the hollow space. He shut the door behind him, blocking the noise from the main yard. The sudden quiet settled like a weight, but it was the kind of silence he needed. He moved to the workbench, pushed aside damaged engine housing, broken clamps, and tools left from the previous night's repairs. His hands were stiff, but his thoughts were clear. He laid out a piece of scrap metal and pulled a charcoal pencil from his pocket. The rough outline of the heating tunnel took shape in steady lines. Fuel drums cut open and bolted together, insulated with spare canvas, fitted with vents scavenged from damaged aircraft. Airflow would come from a working generator, not from open torches that heated unevenly. The design was crude, but the principle was correct. Warm air needed to surround the engine, not strike it in scattered bursts. As he worked, he addressed the gaps left unresolved on the airfield. The supply chain delays meant official heating equipment would not arrive in time. The officers' temporary fixes failed because the engines were freezing from within, not on the surface. The younger mechanics doubted him because they had never seen a system like the one he imagined. No manual had ever described it, and nothing on the base resembled it. Those doubts had spread across the hangar earlier, and he knew they would surface again once he began building. But none of that stopped him. A gust of wind pushed through a cracked panel, scattering dust across the floor. Mercer steadied the drawing and kept going. The cold bit into his fingers, but the focus kept him grounded. He paused only when he heard the door open. Sergeant Amelia Carter stepped inside, her breath visible in the air. She scanned the hangar, noting the tools, the half-finished repairs, and the drafts drifting through the broken roof. She was used to the conditions. She had spent the last week fighting the same losing battle against the cold. Her gaze finally settled on Mercer. "You didn't sign out for night duty," she said, voice controlled, not accusatory. Mercer looked up, but didn't explain right away. He shifted the scrap metal toward her so she could see the sketch. She studied it carefully, taking in the structure, the vent system, and the airflow direction. She didn't dismiss it. She didn't laugh. She didn't ask why he was working alone. Instead, she stepped closer. "How much material do you need?" she asked. The question eased something tight in his chest. 3 fuel drums, he said. 2 damaged vents from the parts yard. Engine hose, the longer kind. Carter nodded. "I'll get authorization." He expected resistance from her. Rules, procedures, questions about safety, but none came. She understood the urgency even without being told. She had been on the line, each morning watching engines refuse to start. She had seen the bearings crack and the crews return half-frozen, exhausted, angry, and shaken. Before she stepped out, she turned back. "If this works, we'll need more than one." "I know," Mercer answered. The hangar door closed behind her, leaving the cold and silence again. Mercer exhaled slowly and continued sketching the internal braces that would hold the tunnel's shape. He calculated airflow length, temperature loss, and how much power the generator needed to maintain consistent heat. The work drew him in deeper, tightening his focus, steadying his breathing. For the first time in weeks, the problem felt manageable. An hour later, Carter returned, pushing a cart stacked with fuel drums, vent covers, and a coil of engine hose. She had even brought an extra set of gloves and a lantern. She placed the lantern on the bench, adjusting the flame until a steady glow illuminated the workspace. "Start with cutting the drums," she said. "I'll prep the clamps." There was no ceremony, no unnecessary talk. They worked together with a rhythm that formed smoothly. Mercer cut through metal with a manual saw, sparks scattering across the frozen floor. Carter shaped the openings, hammering edges flat so the parts would fit tightly. They moved with steady purpose, ignoring the cold that seeped into their hands. The lantern cast a warm circle of light that kept their focus anchored on the task. Between measurements, Carter asked the questions that others avoided. Will it fit each bomber model? Yes, if the brackets are adjustable. Will the airflow stay even? With the generator running at full output, is the material strong enough? It only needs to hold until the engine warms. Her questions filled in the unspoken concerns that needed answers. Concerns the crews had, the officers had, and the pilots silently carried after every freezing morning. She wasn't challenging the design. She was making sure it met the reality of the airfield. By midnight, the rough shape of the tunnel stood upright, 3 drums bolted together, reinforced with braces, lined with scraps of canvas to hold heat. It looked strange, almost improvised, but its structure was solid. Mercer ran his hand along the seam where the drums met. It held. Carter checked the clamps one more time and stepped back. "We should test the airflow." They dragged the generator into position, connected the hose, and lit it. The engine rumbled, sending a vibration through the hangar floor. Warm air flowed through the tunnel, visible where it pushed frost off the metal surface. The heat built quickly, and Mercer felt the first wave of confidence settle in. Not hope, confidence. Carter watched the frost melt from the seams. "It might actually work," she said quietly. Mercer didn't answer. He didn't trust himself to say anything without breaking the focus that anchored him. Outside, the wind slammed against the hangar door. Inside, the generator continued its steady hum. The tunnel radiated warmth across the cold floor. Their improvised device was ready, and by dawn, they would know whether it could save more than a single engine. The generator hummed through the last hours of the night, its steady vibration keeping Mercer and Carter awake as they monitored every joint, seam, and clamp on the heating tunnel. Frost receded from the metal with each passing minute, confirming what they needed to know. The airflow was strong, the heat distribution was even, and the structure could withstand prolonged operation. They didn't celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate until it proved itself on an actual bomber engine. By the time the first signs of dawn touched the sky, the hangar door rattled from activity outside. Mechanics began their shift, officers made their rounds, and pilots walked the flight line with tense expressions. The morning cold was worse than the day before. Ice coated the runway in a thick layer. Even the fuel trucks struggled to start. Carter shut off the generator and wiped condensation from her gloves. "They're going to have questions," she said. "They'll have answers after the test," Mercer replied. He checked the clamps one last time, confirming the structure was stable enough to move. Together, they rolled the tunnel out of the hangar, its metal echoing across the ground. The cold hit hard the moment they stepped outside. The air felt sharp in Mercer's lungs, and the wind cut through his coat, but the urgency pushed him forward. As they approached the nearest B-17 in line for maintenance, conversations around the flight crews slowed. Heads turned. Mechanics paused mid-task. Officers exchanged uncertain looks. The strange metal tunnel, patched with canvas and assembled from scrap, did not resemble anything standard. Doubts spread across the faces watching them. One of the younger mechanics stepped closer with a frown. "What is that supposed to be?" Carter didn't answer. She signaled Mercer to position the tunnel beneath the outboard engine. They lifted it with effort, guiding it into place until the opening aligned with the cowling. Mercer connected the generator hose while Carter secured the braces. The line chief, Captain Rowley, approached with a mix of irritation and curiosity. "Who authorized this?" Carter stood straight. "I did, sir." Rowley's jaw tightened, but his eyes remained on the device. "And what is it?" "An enclosed heating system," Mercer said. "It warms the entire engine compartment." Rowley looked him over, noting the exhausted eyes, the stiff posture, the confidence that didn't waver. "If it damages that engine, you'll both be off this line." Mercer nodded once. "Understood." The tension around them grew as pilots gathered, pulling their jackets tighter against the cold. Some whispered doubts under their breath. Others simply watched, desperate for anything that could get their aircraft back in the sky without mechanical failure. Carter started the generator. The rumble filled the area. Warm air pushed through the tunnel and into the engine housing. At first, nothing changed. The frost on the cowling remained unmoved. Mechanics exchanged doubtful glances. Rowley folded his arms, waiting for the moment he could shut the operation down. Then the frost began to thin. A thin line of condensation formed near the panel seams. Mercer saw it immediately, an early sign that the heat was spreading behind the metal. He stepped closer, feeling the warmth rising through the air. Carter checked the pressure gauge on the hose, adjusting it to maintain consistent airflow. Rowley moved nearer, eyes narrowing as frost receded from the edges. "Is that melting from the inside?" Mercer didn't respond. He kept watching the cowling, tracking the temperature change by the pattern of thaw. The ice lifted in sheets, revealing clean metal beneath. Moisture dripped onto the frozen ground, steaming as it fell. The moment arrived when the engine was warm enough for a test. Carter shut off the generator. Mechanics opened the cowling, steam rising from inside. For the first time in days, there was no frost choking the intake tubes, no frozen oil filter, no seize bearings. Rowley exhaled slowly. "Start it." The crew chief climbed into position. He primed the engine. He hit the switch. The propeller jerked once, twice, then rotated smoothly. The engine came to life with a steady, even sound. The crew surrounding the aircraft froze in place, stunned by what they heard. Several leaned forward unconsciously, as if attempting to catch any irregular noise. There was none. The hum remained consistent. A second mechanic shook his head. "That shouldn't be possible in this temperature." Carter met Mercer's eyes briefly, the slightest acknowledgement passing between them. Rowley stepped back, his voice low but certain. "Do it again on the next aircraft." They repositioned the tunnel under a second B-17. Officers and pilots followed, forming a growing crowd. The same process repeated. Frost melted, the engine warmed evenly, and the propeller turned without hesitation. No misfires, no freezing points, no cracks from cold stress. With each successful test, the skepticism dissolved. Mechanics approached with questions, not mockery, wanting measurements, material lists, and assembly steps. Pilots who had doubted the idea now watched with relief, their missions no longer threatened by engines frozen solid before takeoff. Carter handled questions with calm precision. Mercer focused on the adjustments needed to optimize airflow for different engine sizes. Neither allowed relief to distract them. The system worked, but the airfield had dozens of aircraft. The task ahead would require long nights and coordinated effort, not pride or celebration. As the second engine settled into a stable idle, Rowley turned to them both. "This needs to be built in every hangar." Today, there were no cheers, no applause, only a collective realization spreading through the flight line. They finally had a way to fight the cold, and for the first time all winter, the mission looked possible again. The order to reproduce the heating tunnel spread across the airfield within the hour. Mechanics hurried between hangars carrying fuel drums, broken vents, discarded clamps, and spare canvas. The noise of cutting tools echoed off the steel walls as crews rushed to construct as many units as possible before nightfall. The urgency was obvious. Dozens of bombers waited on the line, their engines frozen solid, their missions stalled by conditions that had nearly broken the base's operational capability. Mercer and Carter worked at the center of it all, guiding the crews through each step. They corrected airflow angles, reinforced weak joints, and ensured the material held together under extended heat. The younger mechanics, who once joked, now followed instructions carefully, asking precise questions and double-checking measurements. Their shift in behavior came from necessity, but also from seeing the results firsthand. The device didn't rely on luck. It relied on a clear method, one they quickly learned to trust. Throughout the day, pilots observed the progress with growing anticipation. Many had lost friends due to engine failures during takeoff or early climb. Their concern was practical. They needed their aircraft to survive long enough to reach operational altitude. Some approached Mercer quietly, asking whether the system could handle extended warming cycles or repeated starts. He answered each question directly, addressing technical details that crews had worried about but rarely voiced. The cold had caused more than mechanical damage. It had eroded confidence in the machines they depended on. Restoring that confidence mattered as much as thawing the engines. By late afternoon, 5 new tunnels were operational. A row of B-17s and B-24s received full warm-ups, each one producing the same results: melting frost, restored lubrication, steady engine rotations. Crews noted that the systems prevented oil line fractures and eliminated forced downtime caused by frozen bearings. These improvements resolved unspoken doubts the crews carried. Questions about how long the engines could withstand such conditions, whether repairs earlier in the winter had masked deeper structural issues, and whether repeated freezing cycles would make the metal unreliable. The tunnels answered each concern with consistent performance. As daylight faded and temperatures dropped, the base prepared for its first full night using the new system. The tunnels glowed faintly from the generator heat, warming each engine in controlled intervals. Officers revised the mission schedule to reintroduce flights that had been postponed. Crews prepared bombs, fuel, and navigation charts. For the first time in weeks, the airfield's operations staff saw a clear path forward instead of a list of canceled sorties. Inside the main hangar, Mercer tightened the final brace on one of the new units. His hands were stiff from hours of work, and the cold clung to his coat, but his focus remained steady. Carter handed him a fresh set of bolts, her sleeves dusted with metal shavings. They shared a quiet understanding of how much had changed in a single day. The hangar that had once echoed with frustration and doubt was now filled with precise activity. A group of officers entered to inspect the progress. Captain Rowley stepped forward, reviewing each tunnel with a critical eye. He checked the temperature readings, airflow charts, and structural reinforcements. When he finished, he turned to Mercer. "How long can these run continuously?" he asked. 3 hours without overheating, with cool-down intervals between cycles," Mercer replied. "Long enough to warm every engine on rotation." Rowley nodded. "That's enough. The morning mission is back on." The announcement spread quickly. Pilots who had been grounded for days now moved with renewed energy, reviewing flight plans and checking aircraft status. Crews topped off fuel, reloaded supplies, and inspected the warmed engines with a sense of steady relief. Mercer stepped outside with Carter as the generators continued their low vibration across the yard. The sky was already darkening, and the runway lights flickered to life. Rows of bombers stood in silence, their engines thawed and stable. The sight carried a weight he hadn't expected. The system he had built from scrap, born out of frustration and necessity, now supported the entire airfield. Carter watched the rows of aircraft with him. "Tomorrow is going to be different," she said. He nodded, acknowledging not only the operational shift, but the atmosphere around them. The men on the base moved with purpose rather than dread. The tension that had filled the air for weeks began to ease. Repairs that had once seemed impossible now had solutions. And the burden of constant mechanical failures lifted from the crews who had shouldered it through the worst weeks of winter. As night settled fully over the airfield, the generators continued their steady work, pushing warm air through each engine. The cold was still brutal, but it no longer controlled them. They had a way to fight back. And for the first time that winter, dawn promised more than another cycle of frozen metal and exhausted crews. It promised aircraft ready to fly. The airfield woke before sunrise, its lights cutting through the darkness as crews prepared the first full mission since the cold had crippled operations. Frost covered the ground, but it no longer settled inside the engines. Every bomber on the line had undergone a complete warm-up cycle, their metal skins steaming gently as heat escaped through panel seams. The familiar tension of pre-flight activity returned, orders being relayed, ammunition loaded, navigation checks completed, but the frustration and dread of past mornings were gone. Mercer walked the flight line with Carter, confirming each tunnel had completed its final run. Mechanics reported stable oil pressure, responsive throttle control, and no signs of freezing in the bearings or intake lines. These checks quietly addressed questions that had lingered among the crews: whether the warm-up would hold under sustained engine power, whether the internal components could withstand the temperature changes, and whether the day's mission risked the same failures that had haunted them all winter. Engine after engine demonstrated that the new system resolved those fears. Pilots gathered near their aircraft, stamping their boots against the cold while waiting for the signal. Some approached Mercer directly, offering brief nods or quiet thanks. He wasn't comfortable with attention, but he acknowledged each gesture respectfully. He understood why they came. Many of them had flown missions without trusting their engines. Today, they were preparing with confidence instead of hesitation. Captain Rowley reviewed the last set of operational notes and gave a sharp command. "Start them up." The flight line roared to life as the engines ignited one by one. Propellers cut through the air with smooth rotation, free from the grinding sounds that had marked past mornings. Crews watched for smoke, hesitation, or uneven temperatures, anything that might signal a hidden issue, but none appeared. The bombers warmed evenly, just as they had during the tests. Mercer stood still for a moment, listening to the synchronized rhythm of the engines. The sound carried weight. It meant the crews would fly without the mechanical failures that had claimed lives. It meant the airfield could maintain its mission tempo. It meant the work done in the collapsing hangar at night had reached beyond the small corner where it began. Carter stepped beside him, her gloves tucked into her belt after finishing her rounds. "They're ready," she said. "They are," Mercer answered. The bombers began moving toward the runway in formation. Snow dusted off their wheels as they rolled forward. The runway lights cast long reflections across the frost-covered ground. Crews saluted, pilots signaled from their windows, and officers stood in silence as the first aircraft accelerated. The lead B-17 lifted off with steady power. Its engines climbed smoothly, without sputtering or strain. One after another, the rest followed, rising into the pale winter sky. The rumble of their ascent passed over the airfield and echoed across the distant hills. Each aircraft climbed higher, gaining altitude without the sudden drops or warnings that had plagued them weeks earlier. As the last bomber disappeared into the horizon, the field fell quiet. Only the lingering hum of the generators remained. Rowley approached Mercer and Carter, stopping in front of them with a rare expression of satisfaction. "You kept this place alive," he said. "The system stays, and you two will supervise every installation at the neighboring fields. They're facing the same conditions." Carter absorbed the order with a slight nod. Mercer felt a mixture of surprise and resolve. The task ahead would be demanding, but it meant something important. The solution would reach beyond this airfield. Other crews, other pilots, other missions, all would benefit from what they had built. As officers dispersed and mechanics returned to cleanup, Carter walked with Mercer toward the far end of the runway. The horizon brightened with the first real light of morning. Steam rose from the recently warmed engines in thin trails that drifted into the cold air. The winter wind carried no sense of defeat anymore. They reached the edge of the field, where the snow thinned and the view opened toward the distant towns. Mercer stopped and watched the sky, still tracking the faint outlines of the departing bombers. Carter stood next to him, hands in her coat pockets. "You did something important," she said. "We did it," he answered. There was no need for further discussion. Their work had saved aircraft, missions, and the crews who relied on them. The doubts, the shortages, the failures that had nearly brought the airfield to a standstill were now behind them. A new formation of bombers would return later in the day, engines intact and crews safe. And tomorrow, they would do the same. The cycle of frozen mornings had ended. Mercer felt the quiet relief settle in, a grounded, steady feeling he hadn't experienced since losing his brothers. For once, he stood not as a man weighed down by what he had lost, but as someone who had prevented loss for others. Beside him, Carter watched the sunrise. No words were needed. The success was clear, the airfield restored, and the winter no longer an enemy they couldn't fight. The story closed, not with noise, but with the calm certainty that lives had been saved, and that the future missions those bombers would fly carried a safer beginning because two mechanics refused to accept failure.